Sometimes the people who save us arrive quietly enough to be mistaken for ordinary. Snow covered the highway outside Silver Pine Diner in endless waves of white beneath the dark Colorado sky, while freezing wind rattled the old windows hard enough to make the hanging neon sign tremble. Clara Whitmore wiped down the empty counter for the third time in 20 minutes and glanced toward the clock above the coffee machine. 11:47 p.m. Most nights, truckers or late travelers stopped by before midnight, filling the diner with country music, laughter, and the smell of bacon grease and hot coffee. But tonight the storm had swallowed the roads completely. Snow drifted across the highway in thick spirals beneath the pale headlights of abandoned cars sitting motionless along the shoulder. Even the town sheriff had warned people to stay inside until morning. Clara pulled her cardigan tighter around herself and walked toward the front windows. The diner glowed warmly against the storm outside, golden lights spilling across the snow-covered parking lot while steam curled softly from coffee pots behind the counter. Inside felt small but safe. Outside looked endless and cold enough to erase people quietly. She reached for the light switch near the entrance, preparing to close early, when movement appeared through the storm beyond the glass. At first she thought it was another drifting shadow from the wind. Then she saw him. A man walking alone through the snow. Clara frowned slightly and stepped closer to the window. The figure moved slowly beneath the storm, one hand shielding his face from the wind while snow gathered across the shoulders of his dark wool coat. No car nearby. No flashlight. No umbrella. Just one man crossing nearly invisible pavement in weather dangerous enough to shut down half the county. The closer he came, the stranger the image felt. His posture remained upright despite obvious exhaustion. Controlled. Disciplined somehow. Like a man used to enduring uncomfortable things without complaint. Clara unlocked the diner door just as another gust of wind slammed snow against the building. The man reached the entrance seconds later, breathing hard but steady. He looked somewhere in his 40s, maybe older beneath the exhaustion. Snow clung to his dark hair and the collar of his expensive coat, while melting ice traced down the side of his face. Clara noticed the watch first. Silver. Swiss. The kind that costs more than most cars parked in Silver Pine. But his hands were nearly numb from cold. "You should not be outside in this," Clara said softly. The man glanced toward her, surprised by the warmth inside the diner more than the words themselves. His blue eyes looked tired in a way sleep could not fix. "Neither should you," he replied quietly. His voice carried the polished calm of someone used to boardrooms and private meetings rather than roadside diners buried in snowstorms. Clara stepped aside immediately. "Come in before you freeze." The man hesitated for half a second as though unaccustomed to accepting help from strangers. Then he entered slowly while the storm roared behind him through the open doorway. Warm air wrapped around him instantly along with the smell of coffee and cinnamon pie resting beneath the glass display near the register. Clara closed the door quickly against the wind and handed him a clean towel from beneath the counter. "Sit near the heater," she said. "I will make coffee." The man looked around the quiet diner while removing his gloves carefully. The old vinyl booths. The humming jukebox near the wall. The faded Christmas decorations hanging beside the pie menu. Something softened almost invisibly in his expression. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara gave a small shrug as she poured fresh coffee into a thick ceramic mug. "People freeze faster alone." For a moment, the man simply looked at her across the warm yellow light of the diner, while snow battered the windows outside like the entire world was trying to get in. The storm grew louder after midnight. Wind pushed heavy snow against the diner windows in endless white waves while the old neon sign outside flickered softly above the buried parking lot. Clara Whitmore placed a bowl of hot beef stew in front of the stranger sitting near the heater booth, and watched steam rise slowly between them beneath the warm yellow lights. The man looked more alive now than when he first stepped through the door, though exhaustion still lingered heavily around his eyes. His dark coat hung drying beside the kitchen entrance while melting snow formed a small puddle beneath the rack. Clara noticed again how strange the contrast felt. Everything about him suggested wealth. The watch. The handmade leather shoes now drying near the heater vent. The calm posture of someone used to expensive spaces and people listening when he spoke. Yet tonight he sat alone in a nearly empty roadside diner with frozen hands wrapped around a ceramic coffee mug like it was the first warm thing he had touched all day. "You did not have to make food," he said quietly as Clara set down a spoon beside the bowl. "You looked hungry," she replied simply. The man studied her for a moment, as though trying to understand something uncommon. "Most places would have closed already." Clara leaned lightly against the counter behind the booth. "Most places do not get many customers during blizzards." A faint smile touched his face for the first time that night. Tired but real. Outside, the storm swallowed the highway completely now. Snow drifted nearly halfway up the diner windows while distant pine trees disappeared beneath darkness and wind. The small building felt isolated from the rest of the world in a strangely peaceful way. The stranger finally took a spoonful of stew and paused briefly after tasting it. "This is good," he admitted quietly. Clara shrugged. "My grandmother's recipe." He nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. "You seem calm for someone stranded in the middle of nowhere during a storm." Clara glanced toward the windows where snow hammered softly against the glass. "Colorado teaches people not to panic over weather." The man looked down at the steaming bowl again. "Still," he said softly, "most people would ask questions first." Clara tilted her head slightly. "About what?" "About why I was walking alone in a blizzard." Clara considered the question for a moment, while country music played quietly through the diner speakers overhead. "You looked cold," she said finally. "That seemed more important." Silence settled comfortably between them after that. The heater hummed softly nearby while coffee continued brewing behind the counter. For the first time in hours, maybe longer, the stranger seemed to relax slightly against the booth seat. Clara noticed small details as he ate slowly. His manners were careful. Controlled. The kind learned in formal rooms and expensive company. Even exhausted, he carried himself with quiet authority impossible to hide completely. "What is your name?" Clara asked gently. The man looked up from the bowl. For half a second, he hesitated. "Edward," he answered finally. Clara nodded once. "I am Clara." Edward glanced around the diner again, while snow rattled the windows harder beneath another gust of wind. The old jukebox near the wall. The faded menu board handwritten in blue marker. The tiny ceramic Christmas village sitting near the register even though the holidays had passed weeks ago. Something in his expression softened again. "You own this place?" he asked. Clara laughed quietly beneath her breath. "No. I just survive here." Edward looked at her carefully then, like someone hearing honesty after too many conversations built from performance. "That might be rarer than ownership these days," he said softly. Clara poured fresh coffee into his mug while steam curled gently between them. "You sound like someone who has spent too much time around dishonest people." Edward stared into the dark coffee for several seconds before answering. "Money attracts people who become very good at pretending." The words carried weight heavier than casual conversation. Clara noticed immediately. Whatever brought him into the storm tonight was not simple bad luck. Something had driven him away from somewhere warmer. Somewhere safer. But she did not push further. People spoke when they were ready. Outside, the storm continued swallowing the world in white silence while inside Silver Pine Diner, two strangers sat beneath warm yellow lights sharing coffee and quiet conversation like the rest of the world no longer existed. The storm showed no sign of ending. By 1:30 in the morning, snow had buried most of the highway signs outside Silver Pine Diner, while freezing wind pushed thick white drifts against the windows hard enough to shake the old wooden frames. Inside, the diner glowed softly beneath warm hanging lights and the steady hum of heaters fighting against the Colorado winter outside. Clara Whitmore carried a folded blanket from the small storage room behind the kitchen and placed it gently across the empty booth opposite Edward Hale. "You can rest here for a while if you want," she said quietly. Edward looked up from the coffee mug in his hands. "You are serious?" Clara nodded once. Roads will not open before morning. Edward glanced toward the snowstorm raging outside the windows. Even from inside, the cold felt enormous tonight. Endless. He looked back at Clara slowly, almost uncertain how to respond to uncomplicated kindness anymore. Most people would not trust a stranger enough to let him stay. Clara leaned lightly against the counter beside the booth. Most people would not walk 5 miles through a blizzard either. A faint smile touched Edward's face again before disappearing just as quickly. Clara noticed how carefully he avoided speaking about where he came from or where he had been trying to go. Yet the details around him kept telling their own story. The watch on his wrist alone could probably buy the diner twice over. His dark wool coat carried a discreet European label Clara recognized from magazines left behind by tourists. Even the way he held himself felt different from anyone passing through Silver Pine normally. Quiet authority. The kind money could not fully teach but often surrounded. Edward removed the expensive watch slowly and placed it beside the coffee mug before rubbing his eyes with visible exhaustion. Clara noticed faint red marks near his wrist where the cold had settled too deeply into the skin. "You should sleep," she said gently. Edward stared at the steam rising from his coffee for several seconds before answering. "I have not slept properly in months." Something about the honesty in his voice made the diner feel even quieter. Snow swirled endlessly beyond the windows while country music drifted softly from the old radio near the kitchen entrance. Clara sat across from him in the opposite booth, wrapping both hands around her own mug of coffee. "Bad work situation?" she asked carefully. Edward let out a low breath beneath his nose that almost sounded like laughter. "That is one way to describe it." Clara waited silently. People eventually filled silence when they needed to. Edward looked toward the storm outside instead of at her. "Have you ever spent years building something?" he asked quietly. "Only to realize the people around you care more about controlling it than protecting it?" Clara studied him carefully now. The exhaustion in his face no longer looked physical alone. It looked heavier. The kind carried by people surrounded by too many dishonest conversations for too long. "My father used to say money changes rooms," Clara replied softly. Edward glanced toward her. "What did he mean?" Clara smiled faintly. "He said once enough money enters a room, people stop saying what they actually think." Edward stared at her for a moment longer than expected. Something about that answer reached him more deeply than she realized. Outside, wind roared across the highway while snow continued swallowing the town in silence. "Your father sounds wise," Edward said quietly. Clara lowered her eyes briefly toward the coffee in her hands. "He owned this diner before he passed away." Edward's expression softened immediately. "I am sorry." Clara nodded gently. "It has been 3 years. Another silence settled between them then, but this one felt warmer somehow. Less guarded. Edward leaned back slowly against the booth seat, while the heater hummed nearby. "You stayed here alone after he died?" Clara shrugged lightly. "Someone had to keep the lights on." Edward looked around the small diner again. The faded red booths. The hand-painted pie menu. The snow-covered parking lot outside glowing faintly beneath the neon sign. It was modest. Ordinary. Yet somehow it felt more honest than most places he had stood inside during the last decade of his life. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent tonight in rooms filled with people worth billions of dollars." Clara looked toward him calmly. "And?" Edward glanced down at the coffee mug warming his hands. "This is the first place all week that felt real." The storm outside softened briefly into quieter snowfall, while warmth settled gently through the diner. Clara noticed Edward's eyes growing heavier now beneath exhaustion he could no longer fully hide. She stood slowly and adjusted the folded blanket across the booth seat. "Get some sleep," she said softly. "Morning usually looks kinder after storms." Edward watched her for several seconds beneath the warm yellow lights before finally nodding once. Then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he closed his eyes in a place where nobody seemed to want anything from him. The storm finally began slowing sometime after 3 in the morning. Snow still drifted steadily across the highway outside Silver Pine Diner, but the violent wind had softened into long, quiet waves brushing against the windows instead of slamming into them. Inside, the diner rested beneath warm yellow light and deep silence broken only by the low hum of heaters and the occasional clink of coffee mugs from behind the counter. Clara Whitmore moved quietly through the empty dining area collecting dishes while Edward Hale slept across the booth near the heater vent wrapped partially in the old plaid blanket she had given him earlier. She noticed immediately how different he looked asleep. Less guarded. Less controlled. The exhaustion remained, but without the constant awareness in his eyes, he suddenly looked less like a powerful businessman and more like someone who had simply carried too much weight alone for too long. Clara glanced toward the expensive watch resting beside his coffee mug again. Even in the soft diner light, the silver face reflected with understated elegance impossible to mistake. Whoever Edward truly was, he came from a world very far away from Silver Pine. Yet something about him tonight felt strangely familiar too. Not the wealth. The loneliness. Clara turned the diner sign from open to closed and walked toward the front windows. Outside, snow buried the parking lot almost completely now. The mountains beyond town disappeared beneath darkness and white fog while distant highway lights glowed faintly through the storm. Most of Silver Pine would remain snowed in until morning plows reached the main roads. Clara folded her arms lightly and breathed against the cold glass. Her father used to love storms like this. He always said snow forced people to slow down long enough to remember what mattered. Behind her, she heard movement from the booth near the heater. Edward sat up slowly, blinking beneath the warm diner lights while snow continued drifting outside the windows. For a second he looked disoriented, like someone waking from a dream too peaceful to feel real. Then his eyes found Clara standing near the window. "I fell asleep," he said quietly. Clara smiled faintly. "That tends to happen when people are exhausted." Edward rubbed a hand across his face slowly before glancing toward the clock above the coffee station. "How long?" "About 2 hours." He looked genuinely surprised by that. "I do not remember the last time I slept that quickly." Clara walked back toward the booth carrying a fresh mug of coffee and set it gently in front of him. Steam curled softly between them beneath the yellow diner lights. "You looked like you needed it." Edward wrapped both hands around the warm mug and stared into the dark coffee for several seconds before speaking again. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have looked like if you had left this town?" Clara leaned against the booth across from him thoughtfully. "Sometimes." Edward glanced toward her. "And?" Clara smiled quietly. "Then morning comes and somebody needs pancakes." A faint laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Real this time. Clara noticed immediately how rare that sounded coming from him. Outside, the storm softened further until only light snow drifted across the parking lot beneath the diner sign. "You make simple things sound important," Edward said softly. Clara shrugged gently. "Simple things usually are important." Silence settled warmly between them again while coffee steamed quietly in their hands. Edward studied her for a long moment beneath the soft diner lights. "You know," he said finally, "most people spend conversations trying to impress someone." Clara tilted her head slightly. "And what do I sound like?" Edward looked around the small diner once more. The faded booths. The quiet warmth. The snow-covered windows glowing softly against the Colorado night. Then he looked back at her with an expression touched by something almost unfamiliar to him now. Peace. Like someone who stopped needing approval a long time ago. Clara lowered her eyes briefly, almost shy beneath the compliment. Outside, the storm clouds finally began breaking apart over the mountains while pale traces of early morning blue slowly touched the horizon beyond the snow. Neither of them noticed yet. But somewhere far down the buried highway, headlights had already begun moving toward Silver Pine in a long, silent line through the snow. Morning arrived slowly over Silver Pine. Pale winter sunlight stretched across the snow-covered mountains while the storm clouds finally drifted apart above the highway outside the diner. Clara Whitmore stood behind the counter pouring fresh coffee as soft gold light filtered through the frosted windows and illuminated the quiet room in warm reflections. The storm had left the entire town buried beneath thick snowdrifts, turning roads, rooftops, and pine trees into endless waves of white. Inside the diner, the heaters hummed softly while the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls filled the air. Edward Hales sat near the booth by the window watching the snowfall ease into silence. He looked more rested than the night before, though the tiredness beneath his eyes had not disappeared completely. Clara noticed he seemed quieter this morning. More thoughtful somehow. "Road crews should clear the highway by noon," she said while setting another coffee mug in front of him. Edward nodded faintly. "You sound disappointed." Clara laughed softly beneath her breath. "I just think storms make people slow down in useful ways." Edward looked out toward the frozen parking lot beyond the glass. "Most people hate being delayed." Clara shrugged lightly. "Most people are rushing toward things they do not even enjoy." The words settled quietly between them while sunlight shimmered across the snow outside. Edward studied her again with that same thoughtful expression he carried throughout the night. Clara never tried to impress him. Never asked what he did for a living. Never searched for status behind his expensive clothes and careful manners. She simply treated him like someone cold who needed warmth. And somehow that felt rarer than anything money had ever purchased for him. "Do you ever regret staying here?" Edward asked quietly. Clara glanced around the diner. The faded red booths. The old pie display. The worn counter her father once leaned against during long winter mornings. "Not really," she answered softly. "This place fed me when I had nowhere else to go after my dad died." Edward looked toward her carefully. "You could probably earn more somewhere bigger." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe." Then she poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter beside him. "But people confuse making money with building a life." Edward lowered his eyes toward the steam rising from his mug. That sentence struck him harder than she realized. For years his world had revolved around acquisitions, negotiations, shareholders, and people measuring worth through numbers large enough to make headlines. Yet sitting inside a roadside diner buried in snow beside a woman who barely owned anything valuable on paper, he suddenly felt calmer than he had in years. Outside, a distant sound rolled faintly through the frozen morning air. Low engines. Clara looked toward the windows. "Probably snowplows," she said casually. But the sound grew louder. Deeper. Not one engine. Many. Edward's expression changed almost invisibly. Clara noticed immediately. Before she could ask anything, movement appeared far down the highway beyond the drifting snow. Headlights. Dozens of them. A long line moving slowly toward town beneath the pale winter sky. Clara stepped closer to the window with mild confusion, while sunlight reflected across the frozen glass. The vehicles became clearer as they approached. Black SUVs. Luxury sedans. Identical headlights cutting through the snow-covered highway in perfect formation. More and more appeared behind them until the road itself seemed filled with dark polished vehicles moving silently through the white Colorado landscape. Clara stared at the scene in disbelief. "What is this?" she whispered softly. Edward remained seated for a moment longer, his eyes fixed quietly on the approaching convoy. The peaceful atmosphere inside the diner shifted instantly beneath the growing sound of engines outside. Silver Pine rarely saw more than a few pickup trucks on winter mornings. Now the entire highway looked like a motorcade from another world. Snow crunched beneath tires as the first vehicles entered town slowly, polished black paint reflecting the pale sunlight across the frozen streets. Clara counted instinctively as more appeared behind them. 10. 20. 40. The line seemed endless. Residents began stepping outside nearby buildings wrapped in winter coats, staring silently toward the road in confusion. Edward finally stood from the booth and walked slowly toward the diner windows beside Clara. The convoy continued approaching through the snow. Calm. Organized. Expensive beyond reason. Clara looked up toward him carefully now. "Edward," she said quietly. Who exactly are you? The convoy rolled slowly into Silver Pine beneath the pale Colorado morning like something unreal crossing through a postcard town buried in snow. Black luxury SUVs and polished sedans stretched across the frozen highway in a line so long Clara Whitmore could no longer see where it ended. Sunlight reflected across dark windows and chrome details while snow crunched beneath expensive tires moving carefully through streets normally filled with pickup trucks and snowplows. Town residents stood outside coffee shops, gas stations, and hardware stores staring silently as vehicle after vehicle passed through drifting white snow. Inside Silver Pine Diner, the warm, peaceful atmosphere from earlier that morning had vanished completely. Clara stood near the front windows beside Edward Hale, while the convoy finally slowed across the parking lot outside. Engines idled softly beneath clouds of white exhaust curling into the freezing air. Clara looked from the vehicles to Edward again, confusion growing across her face. "Edward," she repeated quietly. "What is happening?" Edward remained silent for a moment, while his eyes followed the arriving convoy outside. Then he let out a slow breath beneath his nose, almost disappointed that the quiet night inside the diner had finally ended. "My people found me," he said softly. Before Clara could respond, several black SUVs stopped directly in front of the diner entrance. Doors opened almost simultaneously. Men and women in dark winter coats stepped out quickly but calmly, speaking into earpieces while scanning the snow-covered surroundings with practiced precision. Clara stared in disbelief. This was not ordinary wealth. This looked organized. Corporate. Important enough to move like a government operation. The diner door opened seconds later, letting freezing air rush inside along with two sharply dressed men carrying tablets and leather portfolios. Both looked visibly relieved the moment they saw Edward standing near the windows. "Mr. Hale," one of them said immediately. "We have been searching all night." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Hale." The name landed differently now. Edward nodded calmly while the executives approached. "How many vehicles?" he asked quietly. 115. The older executive answered. "Including security and logistics support." Clara looked toward Edward slowly. Her mind struggled to connect the exhausted man sleeping beneath a plaid blanket hours earlier with the convoy now filling half the town outside. The younger executive glanced around the diner with visible confusion. "Sir, are you all right?" Edward's expression remained calm. "I had coffee." The answer almost sounded amusing coming from him. Clara noticed several more luxury vehicles continuing to arrive outside while townspeople gathered carefully along the sidewalks watching the scene unfold. Even the sheriff's truck had stopped near the gas station across the street. "You disappeared after the Aspen board meeting," the older executive continued carefully. "The entire company has been in panic mode." Edward looked toward the snowy mountains beyond the diner windows. "Good." The executives exchanged uncertain glances. Clara folded her arms lightly near the counter, still trying to process what she was witnessing. "You own a company?" she asked softly. Edward finally turned toward her fully. For a brief moment, the noise outside seemed to disappear beneath the warm diner lights. "Several," he admitted quietly. One of the executives looked genuinely confused by Clara's presence. "Miss, do you know who this is?" Edward answered before she could. "Someone kind enough not to ask." Silence settled briefly between them. Clara glanced outside again at the endless line of black vehicles parked across the snow-covered highway. "You brought all of this here?" she asked quietly. Edward almost smiled. "Not intentionally." The younger executive stepped closer with visible urgency. "Sir, investors, media outlets, and half the board are waiting for updates." Edward looked tired again suddenly. "Not physically. Emotionally." Clara noticed it immediately. The convoy outside represented power, money, pressure, expectation, and noise returning all at once after one quiet night where none of it mattered. "Reschedule everything until tomorrow," Edward said calmly. Both executives froze. "Sir?" Edward glanced toward the booth where he slept hours earlier beneath the old plaid blanket. "For one night," he said quietly. I would like breakfast before the chaos starts again. The executives looked stunned. Clara almost laughed softly beneath her breath. Outside, 115 luxury vehicles sat silently beneath falling snow, while inside the small roadside diner, the billionaire logistics empire of Edward Hale waited patiently for pancakes and coffee. Snow continued drifting gently across Silver Pine while the convoy of black luxury vehicles remained parked along the frozen highway like something transported from another world into the quiet Colorado mountains. Residents still stood outside nearby stores watching silently beneath winter coats and scarves while security teams moved carefully between SUVs speaking softly into earpieces. Inside Silver Pine Diner, warm yellow lights reflected across coffee mugs and frosted windows while Clara Whitmore stood behind the counter trying to absorb the reality unfolding around her. Edward Hale sat calmly in the same booth where he had slept beneath a plaid blanket hours earlier while executives worth more money than the entire town looked toward him waiting for instructions. The contrast felt almost unreal. Clara placed a plate of pancakes and eggs in front of Edward while the younger executive glanced nervously toward his expensive watch. Sir, the board meeting in Chicago has already been delayed twice. Edward cut into the pancakes slowly without urgency. Then they can survive one more delay. The executive looked genuinely uncomfortable hearing those words spoken so casually. Clara noticed immediately how different Edward seemed from the people surrounding him. The executives carried tension constantly. Pressure. Performance. But Edward looked calmer sitting inside the diner eating breakfast than he had when discussing billion-dollar business decisions minutes earlier. You really own all those vehicles? Clara asked quietly while refilling coffee mugs. Edward glanced toward the windows where rows of black SUVs stretched across the snowy road outside. Most belong to the company. Clara shook her head softly in disbelief. That still sounds insane. A faint smile touched Edward's face again. It usually does from the outside. The older executive stepped closer holding a tablet filled with financial reports. Sir, the market reacted badly to your disappearance overnight. Edward barely looked at the screen. Markets panic faster than people. Clara almost smiled hearing that. She leaned lightly against the counter while sunlight reflected softly through the frosted windows across the diner floor. What kind of company needs 115 vehicles to find one man? She asked. The younger executive answered before Edward could. Hale Global Logistics. Clara frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar. Then realization slowly crossed her face. She had seen the company name before on shipping trucks traveling through the interstate. On airport cargo containers. On business magazines abandoned by tourists. Wait, she said quietly. You are Edward Hale? The diner suddenly felt very still. Even the executives stopped moving for a moment. Edward looked toward Clara calmly, almost apologetically. Yes. Clara stared at him in silence while snow drifted softly outside the windows behind the endless line of luxury vehicles. Edward Hale was not simply wealthy. He was one of the most powerful logistics billionaires in the country. News channels talked about him constantly during trade negotiations and economic reports. Entire shipping networks moved because of decisions he made. Yet last night he walked alone through a blizzard needing coffee and warmth like anyone else. Clara let out a soft breath beneath her nose. You slept in my diner booth. Edward looked around the small roadside diner quietly. Best sleep I have had in years. The executives exchanged subtle confused glances again, clearly unaccustomed to hearing their billionaire employer talk this way. Clara studied Edward more carefully now. Somehow knowing the truth made his exhaustion easier to understand. The polished manners. The expensive watch. The loneliness hidden beneath calm conversation. Why were you walking alone in a snowstorm? She asked gently. Edward looked down at the coffee mug warming his hands. Outside, sunlight shimmered across endless snow-covered mountains while security teams waited patiently beside black vehicles in the freezing air. Because I needed silence badly enough to disappear for a night, he answered quietly. The honesty in his voice settled deeply inside the diner. Clara understood then that money had not protected him from exhaustion. If anything, it had amplified it. One executive finally cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, the press already knows your convoy stopped here." Edward looked mildly annoyed by that information. "Of course they do." Clara glanced nervously toward the windows. "People are probably going to start coming here." Edward looked toward her thoughtfully for several seconds before reaching into the pocket of his coat and placing a simple black business card on the counter. No flashy gold lettering. No unnecessary details. Just his name and private contact information. "Then call me if they bother you," he said quietly. Clara stared at the card without touching it. "You barely know me." Edward's expression softened almost invisibly. "That is exactly why I trust you." Outside, the snowstorm had finally passed completely, leaving Silver Pine buried in bright winter sunlight, while 115 luxury vehicles waited silently for the billionaire who spent the night discovering peace inside a diner nobody important was ever supposed to notice. By late afternoon, Silver Pine no longer felt like the quiet mountain town Clara Whitmore had known her entire life. News vans lined the snow-covered streets beside hardware stores and diners while reporters in heavy winter coats stood outside filming the endless row of luxury vehicles still parked near the highway. People filled social media with photographs of the mysterious convoy arriving during the storm, and within hours everyone in town knew that billionaire Edward Hale had spent the night inside Silver Pine Diner. Clara stood behind the counter refilling coffee mugs for curious customers while television screens near the corner booth replayed business headlines discussing Hale Global Logistics and the unexplained disappearance of its founder during a major corporate summit in Aspen. The attention made the small diner feel smaller than ever. Yet somehow Edward remained calm through all of it. He sat quietly near the window booth watching snow fall lightly across the mountains while executives handled endless phone calls around him. Clara noticed he seemed almost detached from the noise surrounding his own name. "You really are not going back today?" she asked softly while setting a plate of pie near him. Edward looked up from the window with faint amusement. "You ask that like my executives do." Clara smiled lightly. "Maybe they are worried." Edward glanced toward the younger executive pacing nervously near the entrance while speaking into a headset. "They are terrified." Clara laughed quietly beneath her breath before sitting across from him for the first time all day. Outside, sunset painted soft gold light across the snow-covered town, while headlights reflected along the frozen roads. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said carefully. Edward nodded once. "Last night," Clara continued softly, "why did you really leave?" Edward stared toward the coffee mug, warming his hands for several silent seconds. The warmth of the diner wrapped gently around them while conversations from nearby tables faded into background noise. "Because I realized I could no longer tell who around me actually cared whether I was happy," he answered quietly. Clara's expression softened. Edward leaned back slowly against the booth seat, while snow drifted beyond the windows. Every conversation became about strategy, profit, expansion, public image. He looked around the diner thoughtfully. "Then I walked in here last night covered in snow, and you treated me exactly the same way you would treat anyone else." Clara lowered her eyes briefly. "You were cold." Edward gave a faint smile. "That is the point." Silence settled warmly between them while evening light faded across the mountains outside. Then suddenly one of the executives approached the booth carrying a thick leather folder. "Sir, the reconstruction estimates arrived." Edward glanced at the folder without interest. "For what?" "The diner." Clara frowned immediately. "What reconstruction?" The executive opened the folder carefully across the table. Architectural drawings, renovation concepts, and financial reports covered the pages beneath polished photographs of Silver Pine Diner. Clara stared in confusion. Edward looked almost embarrassed now. "The roof leaks," he said quietly. "The heating system is 20 years old. Half the booths need repairs." Clara blinked several times trying to process what she was hearing. "How do you know all that?" Edward almost smiled. "I noticed things too." The older executive cleared his throat politely. Mr. Hale instructed our team this afternoon to fully restore the diner at company expense. Clara stared at Edward in shock. You cannot do that. I already did. Clara shook her head immediately. No. Absolutely not. Edward looked genuinely surprised by the refusal. Why? Clara folded her arms lightly while snow continued falling outside the glowing diner windows. Because one night of coffee and pancakes does not justify millions of dollars. The executives exchanged stunned glances again. Most people begged for opportunities around Edward Hale. Clara Whitmore was rejecting one calmly over pie and coffee. Edward studied her carefully beneath the warm yellow diner lights. Then slowly, something almost peaceful crossed his face again. You know, he said softly, everyone around me usually wants more. Clara looked toward him steadily. And maybe that is why they exhaust you. Silence settled deeply between them after that. Outside, headlights reflected across the snow while reporters waited in the cold hoping for photographs of the billionaire inside the tiny roadside diner. But inside Silver Pine Diner, Edward Hale suddenly looked less interested in rebuilding buildings and more interested in understanding the woman who refused to turn kindness into a transaction. 3 months later, winter still covered the mountains around Silver Pine, but the town no longer felt quite the same. Tourists now stopped regularly along the highway hoping to see the diner where billionaire Edward Hale disappeared during the snowstorm that made national headlines. News articles called it the most expensive overnight stay in America, though Clara Whitmore ignored most of them completely. Inside Silver Pine Diner, the warm yellow lights still glowed against snowy evenings exactly as they always had. The old booths remained. The hand-painted pie menu still hung crooked near the kitchen entrance. And despite the sudden attention surrounding the town, Clara fought carefully to keep the diner feeling ordinary. Edward respected that. Which was why when a black SUV finally appeared outside the diner one quiet Thursday evening months later, it came alone. No convoy. No executives. No security teams flooding the parking lot with radios and polished shoes. Just one vehicle moving slowly through falling snow beneath the familiar neon diner sign. Clara looked up from the counter as the door opened and freezing mountain air drifted softly inside. Edward stepped through the entrance carrying snow across the shoulders of a dark wool coat, while the quiet warmth of the diner wrapped around him once again. He looked different this time. Rested. Lighter somehow. Clara smiled before she could stop herself. You found your way back. Edward returned the smile faintly while removing his gloves. Turns out storms are easier to survive once you know where shelter is. Clara laughed softly beneath her breath and poured coffee into his favorite ceramic mug before he even reached the booth near the heater. Outside, snow drifted peacefully across the mountains while country music played quietly through the old diner speakers. Edward sat down slowly and looked around the room with visible relief settling across his face. Still no marble floors, he said quietly. Clara placed the coffee in front of him. We almost installed chandeliers after you left. Edward looked genuinely horrified for a moment, making Clara laugh again. The sound felt warm inside the quiet diner. Familiar now. Edward wrapped his hands around the steaming mug and looked toward the windows where snowflakes drifted beneath the neon glow outside. You kept the diner exactly the same, he noticed. Clara leaned lightly against the booth across from him. You were right about one thing. Edward glanced toward her. What is that? Clara looked around the small diner thoughtfully. People need places that feel real. Silence settled softly between them while coffee steamed beneath the warm yellow lights. Edward's eyes drifted briefly toward the old plaid blanket folded neatly near the heater vent where he once slept during the storm months earlier. The board still complains about the day I delayed the Aspen meeting, he admitted quietly. Clara smiled faintly. Did the company survive? Edward nodded once. Apparently. Clara shrugged lightly. Then maybe pancakes were more important. Edward laughed quietly beneath his breath, shaking his head. You know, every billionaire leadership conference in America claims to teach clarity. He looked around the diner again slowly. And somehow I found more peace sitting here during a blizzard than in 20 years of executive retreats. Clara lowered her eyes briefly toward the coffee mug, warming her hands. Maybe because nobody here cared how rich you were. Edward studied her carefully for several seconds before answering. No. His voice softened slightly. Because you were the first person in a long time who treated me like wealth was the least interesting thing about me. The words lingered gently between them while snow continued falling outside the windows. Clara looked toward the quiet highway beyond the glass where no luxury convoys waited this time. Just one black SUV parked beneath soft winter light. So, she asked quietly, what brings you back to Silver Pine? Edward glanced toward the snowfall outside before answering. Honestly? Clara nodded. Edward looked around the diner one final time. The faded booths. The pie display. The warm yellow light reflecting against snowy windows. The woman standing calmly across from him without asking for anything. I think, he said softly, I miss the only place where nobody wanted something from me. Clara smiled then. Small. Genuine. Outside, snow continued falling peacefully across the Colorado mountains while inside the diner, warmth settled quietly around two people from completely different worlds who somehow understood each other better than most ever would. And somewhere beyond the storm-covered highways and billion-dollar boardrooms, Edward Hale finally realized something money had never taught him. Some people become priceless the moment they ask for nothing.